Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The New Science by Giambattista Vico. We are in Book 2, Section 6, entitled Epitomes of Poetic History. That is the title of Chapter 1. And we will begin with paragraph 679. This whole divine and heroic history of the theological poets was only too unhappily described for us in the fable of Cadmus. For first he slays the great serpent, clears the earth of the great ancient forest. Then he sows the teeth, a fine metaphor as noted above for his plowing the first fields of the world with curved pieces of hard wood, which, before the use of iron was discovered, must have served as the teeth of the first plows, and teeth they continue to be called. He throws a heavy stone, the hard earth which the clients or family wish to plow for themselves, as explained above. From the furrows armed men spring forth. In the heroic contest over the first agrarian law aforementioned, the heroes come forth from their estates to assert their lordship of them, and unite in arms against the plebs, and they fight not among themselves, but with the clients that have revolted against them. The furrows signifying the orders in which they unite and thereby give form and stability to their first cities on the basis of arms, as is all set forth above. And Cadmus is changed into a serpent, signifying the origin of the authority of the aristocratic senates, for which the ancient Latins would have used the phrase Cadmus fundus factus est, and the Greeks said Cadmus was changed into Draco, the dragon that wrote the laws in blood. All of which is what we above promised to make clear, that the fable of Cadmus contains several centuries of poetic history, and is a grand example of the inarticulateness with which the still infant world labored to express itself, which is one of the 7 great sources of the difficulty of the fables which we shall later enumerate. So easy it was for Cadmus to leave a written record of this history in the vulgar characters which he brought to the Greeks from Phoenicia. And Desideratus Erasmus, with 1,000 absurdities unworthy of the learned man who was called the Christian Varro, will have it that the fable contains the story of the invention of letters by Cadmus. Thus the illustrious history of such a great benefit to the nations as the invention of letters, which must have made itself known far and wide, is concealed by Cadmus from the human race in Greece under the veil of this fable, which remained obscure down to the time of Erasmus, in order to keep hidden from the vulgar such a great invention of vulgar wisdom, that from the vulgar these letters received the name of vulgar letters. 2. 680. But with admirable brevity and appropriateness, Homer tells us the same history compressed in the hieroglyph of the scepter bestowed on Agamemnon. Vulcan made it for Jove, as Jove with the first thunderbolts after the flood founded his kingdom over gods and men, which is to say the divine kingdoms in the state of the families. Then Jove gave it to Mercury in the form of the caduceus with which Mercury brought the first agrarian law to the plebs, whence born the heroic kingdoms of the first cities. Then Mercury gave it to Pelops, Pelops to Thyestes, Thyestes to Atreus, and Atreus to Agamemnon. That is, it came down through the line of inheritance of the royal house of Argos. 3. 681. More full and detailed, however, is the history of the world described by the same Homer as depicted on the shield of Achilles. 682. 1. At the beginning there could be seen therein the sky, the earth, the sea, the sun, the moon, and the stars. This is the epoch of the creation of the world. 683. 2. Thereafter were depicted 2 cities. In the one there were songs, hymnials, and nuptials, the epoch of the heroic families composed of children born of solemn nuptials. In the other there were no such things to be seen. This represented the epoch of the heroic families with their famuli, who contracted only natural marriages with none of the solemn rites which surrounded heroic nuptials. So that these 2 cities together represented the state of nature, or of the families. It was to these two cities that Emmaus, the steward of Ulysses, had reference when he spoke of the two cities in his fatherland, both ruled by his father, in which the citizen had all their goods clearly divided, meaning that no part of citizenship was shared in common between them. Hence the city without hymeneals is exactly the quote-unquote other people, as Telemachus in Assembly calls the plebs of Ithaca. And this is Achilles' meaning and complaining of the outrage done him by Agamemnon, who, he says, has treated him as a common laborer with no part in the governing. 684. 3. Then, in this same city of the nuptials, the shield showed parliament laws, trials, and punishments. This accords with the answer of the Roman patricians to the plebs in heroic contests, asserting that nuptials, property, rights, and priesthoods, on which depended the science of laws, and hence of judgments, were all their special prerogatives, since the auspices, which constituted the chief solemnity of nuptials, were theirs. For this reason, viri, quote-unquote men, which meant among the Latins the same as heroes among the Greeks, was the term applied to husbands in solemn matrimony, magistrates, priests, and finally judges, as we have said before. This then is the epoch of the heroic cities, which on the basis of families, of the famuli, rose in strictest aristocratic form. 685. 4. The other city is under armed siege, and the two cities prey on each other by turns. Hence the city without nuptials, the plebs of the heroic cities, becomes a separate and hostile city. This affords striking confirmation of what we have argued above, that the first foreigners, the first hostes, were the plebs of the heroic peoples, against whom, as we have so often quoted Aristotle as saying, the heroes swore eternal enmity. Hence the two cities, regarding each other as alien, carried on eternal hostilities against each other with their heroic raids, as we have explained above. 686. 5. And lastly, there was portrayed on the shield the history of the arts of humanity, beginning with the epoch of the families. For, first of all, there appeared the Father King, ordering with his scepter that the roasted ox be divided among the harvesters. Then there was planted vineyards, then flocks, shepherds, and huts, and last of all dances were depicted. This picture, beautifully and truly following the order of human things, indicated that first of all the necessary arts were invented, agriculture with a view first to bread and then to wine, and then the useful arts, such as herding, then the arts of comfort, like urban architecture, and lastly those of pleasure, represented by the dance. Section 7. Poetic Physics. Chapter 1. Poetic Physics. 687. Passing now to the other branch of the main trunk of poetic metaphysics, along which poetic wisdom branches off into physics, and thence into cosmography, and thus into astronomy, whose fruits are chronology and geography, we shall begin this remaining part of our discussion with physics. 688. The theological poets considered the physics of the world of nations, and therefore the first defined chaos as confusion of human seeds in the period of the abominable sharing of women. It was thence that the physicists were later moved to conceive the confusion of the universal seeds of nature, and to express it, they took the word already invented by the poets, and hence appropriate. The poetic chaos was confused because there was no order of humanity in it, and obscure because it lacked the civil light and virtue of which the heroes were called encliti, illustrious. Further, they imagined it as Orcus, a misshapen monster which devoured all things, because men in this infamous community did not have the proper form of men, and were swallowed up by the void because through the uncertainty of offspring they left nothing of themselves. This chaos was later taken by the physicists as the prime matter of natural things, which, formless itself, is greedy for forms and devours all forms. The poets, however, gave it also the monstrous form of Pan, the wild god who was the divinity of all satyrs, inhabiting not the cities but the forests, a character to which they reduce the impious vagabonds wandering through the great forest of the earth, and having the appearance of men, but the habits of abominable beasts. Afterwards, by forced allegories, on which we shall comment later, the philosophers misled by the name Pan, meaning everything, took him as a symbol for the formed universe. Scholars have also held that the poets meant first matter in the fable of Proteus, with whom Ulysses wrestles in Egypt, Proteus in the water, and the hero out of it, unable to get a grip on the monster who keeps assuming new forms. But the scholars thus made sublime learning out of what was doltishness and simplicity on the part of the first men, who, just as children looking in a mirror will try to seize their own reflection, thought from the various modifications of their own shapes and gestures that there must be a man in the water, forever changing into different shapes. 689. At length the sky broke forth in thunder, and Jove thus gave a beginning to the world of men by arousing in them the impulse which is proper to the liberty of the mind, just as from motion, which is proper to bodies as necessary agents, he began the world of nature. For what seems to be impulse in bodies is but insensible motion, as we said above in the method. From this impulse came the civil light of which Apollo is the character, by which light was discerned the civil beauty, with which the heroes were beautiful. And Venus was the character of this civil beauty, which the physicists later interpreted as the beauty of nature, and even as the whole of formed nature, which is beautifully adorned with all sensible forms. 690. The world of the theological poets was composed of 4 sacred elements: the air, whence Jove's bolts came, the water of the perennial springs, whose divinity is Diana, the fire with which Vulcan cleared the forests, and the tilled earth of Cybele, or Berecynthia. All 4 were elements in divine ceremonies, auspices, water, fire, and spelt. They are watched over by Vesta, who, as we have said before, is the same as Cybele or Berecynthia. She is crowned with the tilled lands, protected by hedges, and surmounted by the towers of high-placed towns, whence the Latin extoris, meaning exiled, as if ex terris. This crown encloses all that was signified by the orbis terrarum, which is properly the world of men. Thence the physicists were later moved to study the 4 elements of which the world of nature is composed. 691. The same theological poets gave living and sensible, and for the most part human forms to the elements, and to the countless special natures arising from them, and thus created many and various divinities, as we have set forth above in the Metaphysics. This gave Plato opportunity to intrude his doctrine of minds or intelligences, that Jove was the mind of ether, Vulcan of fire, and the like. But the theological poets understood so little of these intelligent substances that down to Homer's time they did not understand the human mind itself in so far as, by dint of reflection, it opposes the senses. On this there are 2 golden passages in the Odyssey, in which it is called sacred force or occult vigor, which mean the same thing. Chapter 2. Poetic Physics Concerning Man or Heroic Nature. 692. But the greatest and most important part of physics is the contemplation of the nature of man. We have set forth above in the Poetic Economy how the founders of Gentile humanity, in a certain sense, generated and produced in themselves the proper human form in its 2 aspects. That is, how by means of frightful religions and terrible paternal powers and sacred ablutions, they brought forth from their giant bodies the form of our just corporature, and how by the discipline of their household economy they brought forth from their bestial minds the form of our human mind. Here is a proper place for calling attention again to that development. 693. Now the theological poets, in their extremely crude physics, saw in man these 2 metaphysical ideas, being and subsisting. Certainly the Latin heroes understood being quite grossly in the sense of eating. This must have been the first meaning of the verb sum, which later was used in both senses, just as nowadays, When our peasants want to say that a sick man lives, they still say he eats. For sum in the sense of being is extremely abstract, transcending all particular beings, most pervasive, penetrating all beings, most pure, as not being circumscribed by any. They apprehended substance, that which stands beneath and sustains, as residing in the heels because a man stands on the base of his feet. Hence Achilles carried his fate in his heel, since there stood his fate or lot of living or dying. 694. The composition of the body they reduced to solids and liquids. Under the heads of solids they included in the first place the viscera or flesh, as among the Romans visceratio was then term applied to the distribution by the priest to the people of the flesh of sacrificial victims, so that they used the verb vesi for taking nourishment when the food was flesh. Next, bones and joints. The latter were called artis, from ars, which to the ancient Latins meant the force of the body, whence artitas, meaning robust of person. Later, ars was applied to any set of precepts which steadies and directs some faculty of the mind. Then the sinews. When the poets were still mute and spoke by physical things, they took the sinews for forces, from one of these sinews called fides, in the sense of cord, and the force of the gods was called their fides, or faith, and from this sinew, or cord, or force, they later fashioned the lute of Orpheus. And indeed they justly place their forces in the sinews, for it is the sinews that stretch the muscles, which is necessary to the exercise of force. And lastly the marrow, in which with an equal sense of fitness they place the essence of life, whence medulla was a term applied by the lover to the woman he loved, and medullatus was equivalent to our phrase, with all one's heart, and great love was said to consume the marrow. The liquids, on the other hand, they reduced to blood alone, for the neural or spermatic substance they called also blood, as is shown by the poetic phrase sanguine cretus for begotten. Here, too, with a just sense, for this substance is the essence of the blood. And again, with fine perception, they regarded the blood as the juice of the fibers of which the flesh is composed. Hence the Latin expression succipolnus for fleshy, meaning steeped in good blood. 695. As for the other part of our human form, the soul, anima, the theological poets placed it in the air, which is also called anima by the Latins, and they thought of it as the vehicle of life. Hence the propriety of the Latin phrase anima vivimus, and of the poetic locutions fari ad vitales aras, to be born, ducere vitalis aras, meaning to live, vitam referi in aras, meaning to die, and in prose Latin, animam ducere, to live, animam tahere, to be at the point of death, animam efflare imitare, to die. Whence perhaps the motive of the physicist for placing the world soul in the air. And the theological poets, again with a just sense, put the course of life in the course of the blood, on whose proper flow our life depends. 696. They must with a sense equally just have felt that the spirit, animus, is the vehicle of sensation, for in good Latin the phrase survived animo sentimus, and again with a just sense they made spirit, animus, masculine, and soul, anima, feminine, for spirit acts on soul. It is the igneous vigor of which Virgil speaks, so that spirit must have its subject in the nerves and the neural substance, and soul must have it in the veins and the blood. Thus the vehicle of the spirit is the ether, and that of the soul is the air, accords with the relative swiftness of animal spirits and slowness of vital spirits. And as the soul is the agent of motion, so the spirit is the agent, and therefore the principle of voluntary action, as the aforesaid igneous vigor of Virgil. The theological poets sensed as much, but without understanding it, and after Homer they used such expressions as sacred force, occult vigor, and unknown God, as the Greeks and Latins, when in saying or doing anything, They sensed a superior principle within themselves, would say that some god had willed that thing. Such a principle the Latins called mens animi, the mind of the spirit. Thus, in a crude fashion, they apprehended the lofty truth that ideas come to man from God, which later the natural theology of the metaphysicians proved by invincible reasoning against the Epicureans, who would have thought it that they spring from the body. 697. They understood generation in such a way that it is difficult to say whether later scholars have been able to express it more appropriately. The way in which they understood it is all contained in the word concipere for concapere, which expresses the natural activity of physical forms, which must now be supplemented by the weight of the air, demonstrated in our times, and taking from everywhere around them the bodies within their reach, overcoming their resistance, adapting and assimilating them to their own form. 698. Decay they expressed very sagaciously in the verb corrompi, signifying the breaking down of all the parts composing a body, as opposed to sanum, for the sound and healthy condition of all the parts in which life consists. They must accordingly have thought of disease as bringing on death by corrupting the solids of the body. 699. They reduced all the internal functions of the spirit to 3 parts of the body: the head, the breast, and the heart. To the head they assigned all cognitive functions. As among them these were all imaginative, they located memory, memoria being the Latin term for fantasia or imagination, in the head. And in the returned barbarian times, fantasia was used for ingenio, and an ingenious or witty man was called a fantastic man. Cola di Rienzo is so described by the author of a contemporary biography in barbarous Italian, a record of natures and customs like those of the ancient heroes we are discussing, which is a great evidence of the recurrence of natures and customs in the course of the nation's run. Imagination, however, is nothing but the springing up again of reminiscences, and ingenuity or invention is nothing but the working over of what is remembered. Now, since the human mind at the time we are considering had not been refined by any art of writing, nor spiritualized by any practice of reckoning or reasoning, and had not developed its powers of abstraction by the many abstract terms in which languages now abound, as we said above in the method, it exercised all its force on these 3 excellent faculties which came to it from the body. All 3 appertain to the primary operation of the mind, whose regulating art is topics, just as the regulating art of the second operation of the mind is criticism. And as the latter is the art of judging, so the former is the art of inventing, as has been said above in the last corollaries of the poetic logic. And since naturally the discovery or invention of things comes before criticism of them, it was fitting that the infancy of the world should concern itself with the first operation of the human mind, for the world then had need of all inventions for the necessities and utilities of life, all of which had been provided before the philosophers appeared, as we shall fully show in the discovery of the true Homer. With reason, then, did the theological poets call memory the mother of the muses, which, as we have found above, were the arts of humanity. 700. In this connection, we must not omit an important observation of great relevance to the statement in the method, that we can now scarcely understand and cannot at all imagine how the first men thought who founded Gentile humanity. For their minds were so limited to particulars that they regarded every change of facial expression as a new face, as we observed above in the fable of Proteus, and for every new passion they imagined a new heart, a new breast, a new spirit. Hence the poetic plurals, dictated by this nature of human things, rather than by the requirements of counting ora, vultus, animi, pectora, corda, for example, being employed for their singulars. 701. They made the breast the seat of all the passions, and with the due sense of fitness they placed beneath it the fomenting principles. 1. The irascible in the stomach, because there we feel the spreading of the bile, expressed from the surrounding biliary vessels by the intensification of the peristaltic action of the stomach. And 2. the concupiscible more than anywhere else in the liver, which is defined as the blood factory. The poets called these organs the praecordia. The Titan Prometheus implanted therein the passions of the other animals, taking from each species its ruling passion. In a rough way, they understood that concupiscence is the mother of all the passions, and that the passions have their dwelling in our humors. 702. The heart they made the seat of all counsel, whence the heroes agitaban, versaban, volitaban corda curas, for being stupid and insensate, they gave no thought to things to be done, except when shaken by passions. Hence the Latins called wise men cordati, and simpletons contrariwise vecordus, and their resolutions they called sententiae, because they judged as they felt, whence heroic judgments were always true in form, though often false in substance. Chapter 3. Corollary on Heroic Sentences. 703. Now since the minds of the first men of the Gentile world took things one at a time, being in this respect little better than the minds of beasts, for which each new sensation cancels the preceding, which is the cause of their being unable to compare and reason discursively, therefore their sentences must all have been taken as singulars by those who heard them. Hence the sublime sentence admired by Dionysius Longinus, and the Ode of Sappho, which Catullus later turned into Latin, in which the lover, in the presence of his mistress, expresses himself by the simile, "Like a god he seems to me," yet falls short of the highest degree of sublimity, because the lover does not make the sentence singular to himself, as Terence does when he says, "We have attained the life of the gods." This sentiment, though proper to him who speaks, still has the air of a common sentiment because of the Latin usage of plural for singular in the first person. However, in another comedy of the same poet, this sentiment is raised to the highest degree of sublimity by being made singular and appropriated to him who expresses it. I am become a god. 704. On this account, abstract sentences are the work of philosophers, because they contain universals, and reflections on the passions are the work of false and frigid poets. Chapter 4. Corollary on Heroic Descriptions. 705. Finally, they reduce the external functions of the spirit to the 5 senses of the body. But senses keen, vivid, and strong for these men were all robust imagination, with very little or no reason. Evidence of this may be found in the terms they used for the senses. 706. Their word for hearing was audire, as if hauire for the ears drink in the air, which has been set in motion by other bodies. Seeing distinctly, this was called cinere oculi, whence perhaps the Italian cinere, for the eyes are like a sieve, and the pupils like 2 holes, and as from the sieve streams of dust pour down to touch the earth, so from the eyes, through the pupils, stream forth rays of light to touch the objects which are distinctly seen. This is the visual ray of which the Stoics later treated, and which in our day has been happily demonstrated by Descartes. The general expression for seeing was usupare oculi, as if things seen were actually taken possession of by sight. Tangere, to touch, meant also to steal, for to touch a body is to take something away from it, as our more intelligent physicists are just beginning to understand. Smelling they called olfacere, as if by smelling odors they created them, as indeed later the natural philosophers, with their grave observations, found it to be true that the senses make the qualities that are called sensible. And lastly they called tasting sapere, a word which properly applies to the things which have savour, because they assayed things for the savour proper to them. Hence later, by a fine metaphor, they used the term sapientia, wisdom, for the faculty of making those uses of things which they have in nature, not those which an opinion supposes them to have. 707. Herein is divine providence to be admired, because, having given us the senses for the guarding of our bodies, at a time when men had fallen into the state of brutes, in whom the senses are keener than in men, Providence saw to it that by their brutish nature itself, They should have the keenest senses for their self-preservation. Later, when they entered the age of reflection, by which they could take counsel for the protection of their bodies, the senses were permitted to become less sharp. Because of all this, the heroic descriptions, as we have them in Homer, are so luminously and splendidly clear that all later poets have been unable to imitate them, to say nothing of equaling them. Chapter 5. Corollary on Heroic Customs. 708. By such heroic natures, furnished with such heroic senses, customs of little kind were formed and fixed. Because of their recent gigantic origin, the heroes were in the highest degree awkward and wild, such as we have found the Patagonians described, very limited in understanding, but endowed with the vastest imaginations and the most violent passions. Hence they must have been boorish, crude, harsh, wild, proud, difficult, and obstinate in their resolves, and at the same time easily diverted when confronted with new and contrary objects. Even as we daily observe in our stubborn peasants, who yield to every reasonable argument that is put to them, but because their powers of reflection are weak, as soon as the argument which has moved them has left their minds, return at once to the original purpose. From this same lack of reflective capacity, the heroes were bluff, touchy, magnanimous, and generous, as Homer portrays Achilles, the greatest of all the Greek heroes. It was with such examples of heroic customs in mind that Aristotle made it a precept of the art of poetry that the heroes who are taken as protagonists in tragedies should be neither very good nor very bad, but should exhibit a mixture of great vices and great virtues. For that heroism of virtue which realizes its highest idea belongs to philosophy and not to poetry, and gallant heroism is a creation of post-Homeric poets, who either made up fables of a new cast, or took the old fables, originally grave and severe, as becoming the founders of nations, and altered and finally corrupted them to suit the growing effeminacy of later times. We have a great proof of this, and it may well serve as a leading canon of the historical mythology we are discussing, in the example of Achilles. On account of Briseis, taken from him by Agamemnon, he makes such an outcry as to fill heaven and earth and provide matter for the whole Iliad. Yet nowhere in that entire epic does he give the faintest indication of amorous passion at being deprived of the girl. Similarly, Menelaus, though on Helen's account he stirs all Greece to war against Troy, does not show, throughout that whole long and great war, the slightest sign of amorous distress or jealousy of Paris, who has robbed him of her and is enjoying her. 709. All that we have remarked in these three corollaries on heroic sentences, descriptions, and customs belongs properly to the discovery of the true Homer, which we shall take up in the following book. This is the end of Part 19 of The New Science by Giambattista Vico. In the next video, we will proceed in Book 2 to Section 8, entitled Poetic Cosmography. Thank you for listening.